there is a photograph that stopped time. Not a photograph of a goal, not a photograph of a trophy. A photograph of a man alone on the pitch, still wearing his yellow shirt soaked through with sweat, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if he were sleeping standing up. Around him, confetti, embraces, shouts, euphoria. And there he was, motionless, in an inner silence that no camera ever fully captured. That man was Pelé. And what happened on that 21st of June, 1970, at the Estadio Azteca in Mexico, was not simply a football match. It was the flawless execution of something humanity had never seen on a pitch before, and would likely never see again in quite the same way. But there is something that almost no one knows about that final. Something buried in the background for decades, involving medical secrets, political pressure, an extraordinarily risky gamble made by the Brazilian coaching staff, and a player who almost did not take to the field that day. If you think you know the story of the 1970 World Cup, prepare yourself to discover that you only knew the surface. Let us begin at the beginning, but not the obvious beginning. Not the group stage draw, not the tournament's opening. Let us begin in a hotel room in Guadalajara, at 3 in the morning, 4 days before the final, where the Brazilian national team's doctor, Lidio Toledo, was sitting before a medical report he would have preferred no one had seen. The report stated that one of the squad's most important players, someone who would be an absolutely fundamental piece in the strategy of João Saldanha and later of Zagallo, was suffering from inflammation in his right ankle that, technically, prevented him from playing in full physical condition. That player's name was Gérson. And Gérson, for those who may not know, was the brain of that team. He was the distribution engine, the intellectual muscle of the Brazilian midfield, the man who dictated the tempo, who could change the game's pace with a single pass. Without Gérson, the Brazil of that championship was a different team. Still better than every other team in the world, certainly, but different, less orchestrated, less unpredictable. And Zagallo knew that. Zagallo knew that putting Gérson on the pitch while risking a more serious injury was a gamble. But not playing Gérson was a certainty that Brazil would reach the final changed, perhaps vulnerable at one or two moments that, against Italy, could prove costly. Italy. It is worth pausing here for a moment to talk about the Italy of 1970, because they are a fundamental character in this story, and are far too often treated as a supporting act when in reality they were a frightening power. The Italians arrived at that final unbeaten throughout the entire competition. They had Mazzola, they had Rivera, they had the tournament's most organized defense. And they had something more, something that came from a semi-final that was, in itself, one of the greatest matches in the history of world football, the game still called in Italy Il Partita del Secolo, the match of the century, in which Italy defeated West Germany 4-3, in a breathtaking period of extra time that left the entire watching world exhausted. 5 goals scored in extra time alone, players collapsing from fatigue, defenders improvising as strikers, attackers defending. A glorious chaos. And Italy won. They arrived at the final with momentum, with confidence, carrying the weight of 2 previous world titles and the certainty that they had the technical quality to neutralize any national team on the planet. But what the Italians had not counted on was what Brazil had done throughout that entire championship. And here begins the true mystery of the 1970 World Cup, something that football historians still debate to this day. How is it possible for a team to play so well, so consistently, so aesthetically perfectly throughout an entire tournament, with each match appearing to be a different work of art, and yet arrive at the final with physical and technical reserves enough to produce perhaps the finest football that tournament had seen? The answer lies in Zagallo, and in certain decisions he made that were questioned at the time by everyone, including the Brazilian press, which refused to forgive the coach for weeks. Mario Zagallo had taken charge of the national team in controversial circumstances. João Saldanha, his predecessor, was a fascinating figure, a former goalkeeper, a combative journalist, an avowed communist at a time when that in Brazil was a declaration of war, and had qualified the country for the World Cup with vibrant, attacking football. But Saldanha was unstable. He had threatened, literally, to physically assault a player who criticized his team selection. He had clashed with the coaching staff, with the CBD, with the military government itself, which, yes, closely monitored the national team's results because it understood football as a tool of national propaganda. And he had committed an unforgivable sin. He had stated publicly that Pelé had eyesight problems and might not play in the World Cup. Pelé, the greatest player in the world. Saldana was dismissed. And Zagallo stepped in. Zagallo was different. He was disciplined, methodical, almost military in his organization. He had played in World Cups, held 2 titles as a player, and understood the weight of that shirt from a place that few coaches had ever known. And he made courageous decisions from the very start. The first and most controversial was to keep Pelé, obviously, but to build around him a system that balanced individual genius with collective responsibility. Tostão, Rivelino, Jairzinho, Clodoaldo, Gérson and Pelé in the same team was almost unfair to the rest of the world. These were 6 players who, in any other national team of the era, would have been the undisputed leader. In the Brazil of 1970, they were the collective. And it was that collective that arrived in Mexico carrying the weight of a national team that had failed in 1966 in England, where Brazil were eliminated in the group stage in humiliating fashion, with Pelé repeatedly kicked and knocked down without the referees intervening, a scandal that still generates controversy among specialists to this day. Pelé had publicly sworn that he would not play in another World Cup after 1966. He had said that football had become too violent, that the protection of skillful players was insufficient, that it was not worth the risk. And here is a secret that very few people know. What made Pelé change his mind was not a conversation with the CBD, not pressure from the federation, not money. It was a conversation with his father, Dondinho, who had dreamed his entire life of seeing his son become world champion for a 3rd time, something that had never happened in football history with any other player. And Pelé went, with a promise to himself that, if they kicked him again, he would protect himself, but that he would not sacrifice the way he had always played. What happened on the pitch in Mexico was the vindication of that decision. Brazil swept through the group stage, destroying Czechoslovakia 4-1, defeating England 1-0 in a match that produced one of the most famous saves in football history, when Gordon Banks flew through the air to parry a header from Pelé that seemed impossible to stop. To this day that save is called the save of the century, and Pelé, watching it live, turned his head and said, "My God, he saved it." They went on to defeat Romania 3-2, eliminate Peru in the quarterfinals, and reach the semi-final, where they beat Uruguay 3-1 in what was, emotionally, the heaviest match of the competition for Brazilians, because Uruguay was the ghost of 1950, the butcher of the Maracana, the wound that had never fully healed. But let us return to the final. Let us return to the Azteca pitch, to June 21, 1970, to a hot, luminous afternoon on the Mexican high plateau. 187,872 spectators. That is the official figure recorded in FIFA's archives. But eyewitness accounts from the time speak of more than 200,000 people crammed into that stadium, because access controls were nothing like what they are today, and people came in wherever they could find a way. The noise was deafening. The heat was suffocating. And both teams needed all of that as fuel, because what was at stake went far beyond a cup. For Brazil, it was the conquest of a 3rd title, which would give the country the right to keep the Jules Rimet Trophy permanently, since FIFA regulations stipulated that the first country to win 3 World Cups would keep the trophy forever. It was history. It was eternity. It was the end of a generation that had carried the weight of 1966 on their backs for 4 years. For Italy, it was the chance to equal Brazil's world titles. It was the vindication of an entire school of football that prided itself on defensive organization against the Brazilian style, seen by many Europeans of the era as too unpredictable, too flamboyant, too difficult to prepare for. The Italians believed that, with discipline and counter-attacking play, they could control the game. And they had reason to believe it. They had done exactly that throughout the entire championship. But then the match began. And in the first 18 minutes, something happened that no one had expected, something that turned the psychology of the match upside down before the game had even found its rhythm. Italy took the lead. Roberto Bonacegna seized on a breakdown in communication in the Brazilian defense, pounced on a loose ball, and struck it hard and without hesitation. 1-0 to Italy. The Azteca fell silent for a few seconds. Not the silence of the Brazilians, because the majority of the local support was backing Brazil with fierce Latin American fervor. But a silence of collective astonishment, of an unspoken question. And now? And it was in that moment, precisely that moment of adversity, that the Brazil of 1970 showed the world who they truly were. Not with desperation, not with anxiety, with football. Clodoaldo collected the ball in midfield and distributed it calmly. Rivelino advanced down the left. Pele drew the marking to the center. Tostão appeared in the space that Pele had created. And before anyone knew it, the ball was in the Italian net. Pele with his head, with class, with precision, with perfect timing. 1-1. And the match became something else entirely. Italy, who had played with security and control until that moment, began to drop back slightly, testing what Brazil would do. And Brazil did everything. Gérson, who had been tested physically to the very last second by the coaching staff, took to the pitch, ran, dictated the tempo, and in the second half, with Brazil in full pressing mode, collected the ball at the edge of the area and struck it with his left foot at an angle that looked impossible. The ball went in. 2-1. The Azteca erupted. And 3 minutes later, in a move that summarized everything Brazil had been throughout that championship, Gérson found Pele inside the area. Pele with his back to goal controlled it on his chest, laid it off first time to Jairzinho who was arriving from the right, and Jairzinho, without hesitation, struck it first time into the corner. 3-1. 3-1 for Brazil, and the world already knew what was going to happen. But the fourth goal. The fourth goal is where history enters the territory of a work of art. It is the moment still replayed, analyzed and admired in slow motion and at full speed by sports historians, by coaches, by players from entirely different generations, by people who have never watched football in their lives but who, when they see those images, understand instinctively that something extraordinary has taken place. Clodoaldo received the ball near the defensive half-circle, surrounded by 3 Italian players. 3. Any other player, in any other moment in history, would have waited for reinforcements, would have dropped back, would have found a safe way out. Clodoaldo dribbled past all 3 of them. With touch, with rhythm, with that movement of the body that seems to disobey the laws of physics. He emerged from 3 Italian players and passed to Rivelino. Rivelino advanced and passed to Jairzinho. Jairzinho called for the ball and slipped it to Pele, who had dropped back. Pele controlled it and opened the play to Rivelino on the left. Rivelino crossed for Carlos Alberto, the captain, who was arriving at full speed down the right, and without looking, without needing to look, because he already knew where the ball would be because he had made that run as if he had rehearsed it his entire life, he struck it first time with his right foot. And the ball went in with a power and a precision that felt like the full stop at the end of a sentence that football had spent years trying to complete. 4-1. The Jules Rimet Trophy belonged to Brazil forever. And it was then, amid the chaos that followed, with players weeping, with supporters flooding the pitch, with the entire world trying to process what it had witnessed, that the photograph was taken. Pele in the middle of the commotion, his eyes closed, at peace. There was nothing left to do. There was nothing left to prove. Football had arrived, that day, on that pitch, in that moment, at its highest point. And everything that would come after, all the tactical evolution, all the championships, all the generations of extraordinary players that the sport would produce in the decades that followed, would always have that match as a reference, as a benchmark, as the place to look when you want to understand what football can be when it reaches its fullness. But there is one more detail that almost no one knows. A detail revealed years later by Zagallo himself in an interview with the Brazilian press. On the eve of the final, gathered with his players at the hotel in Guadalajara, Zagallo looked at that group of extraordinary talents and said something none of them ever forgot. He said that Brazil was not going to Mexico to win the World Cup. Brazil had already won the World Cup in 1958 and in 1962. Brazil was going to Mexico to win football itself. To show the entire world, from every region, from every tradition, from the European schools to the African ones that were beginning to emerge with real force, from the Asian ones that were watching with growing attention, that there was a way of playing that was unlike anything else. That was art before it was a result. That was beauty before it was tactics, and that one day, someone somewhere in the world would see those images and understand that football had been invented for precisely that purpose. For those 90 minutes. For that fourth goal. And that was exactly what happened. The 1970 World Cup is not discussed merely as the tournament in which Brazil won the third championship. It is discussed as the moment in which football found its own definition. The moment in which the most popular sport on the planet looked at itself and recognized, for the first time, what it was truly capable of being. That legacy crossed decades, influenced generations of coaches in Europe, in South America, in Africa, in Asia. The way African football began to be recognized internationally during the 1970s and 80s has roots in that moment, because players from countries like Cameroon, like Senegal, like Ivory Coast grew up watching those images and understanding that individual skill was a legitimate asset, not something to be suffocated by rigid systems. The very tactical evolution of European football, which underwent a process of opening up through the 1980s and 90s, carries echoes of what Brazil showed in Mexico. Modern football, with all its technology, its VAR, its data, its elite physical preparation and its real-time performance analysis, has still never produced anything that surpasses that fourth goal. It has still never found a combination of players, of system, of moment, and of collective inspiration that comes close to what happened on that 21st of June at the Azteca. And perhaps it never will. Because some things cannot be reproduced. Some things happen once, at the right time, with the right people, and then exist forever as proof that the impossible is sometimes just the name we give to what has not yet happened. That was the story of the 1970 final. It was not a match. It was the greatest work of art that football has ever produced. If you made it all the way to the end, tell me in the comments what you thought of this story, which was the moment that affected you most in this narrative, and which city and country you are watching this video from right now. I read every comment. Leave your like as well, which helps this channel reach more people who love the history of football the way we do. And if you are not yet subscribed, hit that button now, because every week we bring stories like this one, with the depth and care they deserve. And one detail before we finish. While researching this era of football, I came across a very interesting product connected to the world of classic football and the nostalgia of the sport's greatest moments. One of those discoveries you did not expect, but that makes complete sense if you are the kind of person who loves this type of story. I will not say much, because it is something that needs to be seen to be understood. If you are curious, take a look at the link I have pinned in the very first comment below. It might well be worth your time. And before you leave, know that what happened in 1970 was extraordinary. But there is at least one story in this series that will make you question everything you thought you knew about football. A story that involves a moment of pure injustice, a match that should have been replayed, and a refereeing decision that changed the fate of an entire national team. That story is coming. Stay tuned.